Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 18th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the resignation of SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon, the death toll from the earthquake in Turkey and Syria rising to more than 40,000, and Buckingham Palace announcing the Queen Consort will not be commissioning a new crown for the coronation, but rather upcycling one last used by Queen Mary. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in the Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team, it's the boss man, Holden Frith. From the Week magazine, it's assistant editor Leif Arbuthnot. And it's been too long. Good to have you back, Cindy, host of The Spectator's Chinese Whispers podcasts, Cindy Yu. Okay, Holden, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
When it comes to male contraception, it's a numbers game.
Now I'm going to tell you about sperm numbers. This is going to surprise many of you. The first one is men make 1,000 sperm per heartbeat. That's a lot. The average volume of an ejaculate is about 4 milliliters. A teaspoon is 5 milliliters, so a little bit less. The number of sperm that is considered normal for men is between 15 million and 200 million per milliliter, or 60 million to 800 million sperm per ejaculate. It's a lot of sperm.
And a natural contraceptive, just listening to that. Dr. Diana Blythe presenting at the annual Nobel Conference at Gustavus Adolphus College in 2017. Holden, what's the news this week?
This was the news published on Valentine's Day, of course, that scientists have developed a prototype male contraceptive pill. This may sound familiar because we have seen other similar headlines and other claims like these in the past, but the approach used this time around is different and, according to the researchers involved at least, is more likely to get out of the lab and into the bedroom.
Okay, so what's different about it? What's the science bit?
The main difference in the science is that previous attempts to create a male contraceptive have focused on a hormonal approach, so similar in principle to the approach used with the female contraceptive pill. But the issue with that is that it's taken a long time to build up the contraceptive effect, sometimes several days, in a couple of cases actually 2 months. And also it's meant that people have had to take pills every day, and in some cases actually use one or more gels and apply those to their body twice a day. And that's a level of commitment that drug companies have not been willing to expect of their male customers. And perhaps that skepticism has been shared by some of those men's female partners too. This pill, though, it takes a completely different biological approach, and instead of reducing sperm production, it just stops them swimming, and it takes effect within an hour, and then it also lapses within 24 hours. So it's a much more transient and much more instant effect.
Yeah, and you also get a sort of natural feeling ejaculation as well, so there's not that issue of men feeling emasculated somehow, that it would dry up any semen. It's there, it just doesn't manage to swim its way to an ovum. Leif, what's amazing about this is it's come about because they were looking to cure an eye disease. I mean, nothing to do with male contraception.
I know, it's one of those great cases where, you're just kind of doing something else and then something kind of miraculous comes along. I'm really excited about this development because it's just been one of the issues that me and my female friends have been discussing for ever since we were sexually active, and the burden on women is immense. One of the interesting things in this study is that apparently nearly half of all pregnancies around the world are unintended, which I really didn't know. And so, this could, if lots of hoops to jump through, but if it actually ends up coming onto the market, then lots of women could be much more empowered to take control of their bodies.
But Cindy, when you look at the global levels of contraceptive that are used, the most popular form of contraception around the world is none. And you kind of think, well, we're talking about this being easy for men to take. Well, yes, but a condom is easy. It's not being used.
Yeah, although I don't know if a global viewpoint is a bit too broad in this sense. I mean, we're not going to be looking at having sex with everyone possibly in the world at any one time. So I think, the societal pool here is quite effective in that. Obviously, contraception is a very deeply controversial thing in a lot of the world for religious reasons, not just in Christianity. And so they wouldn't believe in that. Condoms are good for STIs in the sense that they prevent them, but this new pill wouldn't do that. So I think there are kind of advantages and disadvantages there. But if the boys around me start to take it, not that I have sex with all the boys around me, but just in my social pool, then that's all I really care about. In the sense that wider contraception in countries that are overpopulating or having severe child mortality problems, that's almost a different separate issue of public health there.
But there's also the trust issue, Cindy, isn't there? I mean, I suppose it's kind of belt and braces, but would you abandon your own female contraceptive and trust the men around you to take this pill?
I'm not sure. It's a good question. I think that if you are in a long-term relationship, as I am, then if I don't trust him to do that on a basic level, then I'm not really sure why I'm with him. But, if you're going out for a date with someone that you're, a few dates in and you don't really know them very well, and then maybe you wouldn't trust someone. I think fundamentally, Leif's right that there's a kind of gender imbalance here, which has meant that women pick up so much of the slack when it comes to contraception and reproduction, because fundamentally, if you get accidentally pregnant, it's still in your body, it's not in the man's body. So I think, anything that goes some way to evening that out, I'm in favour of.
A few issues ago, The Week reported on a very funny, but also, fairly encouraging phenomenon in France, which is, it must be true, I read it in the tabloid section, which is French men who are knitting these jock straps, which lift the balls up to the body, which warms the balls up and which therefore stops them from being able to impregnate women. And so there is a kind of sweet movement in France of men who seem to care about sharing the burden with their girlfriends or sexual partners. But this science seems a little bit more realistic in terms of, not all men are going to be knitting or crocheting their own jock straps anytime soon.
No, but that's an interesting point, isn't it, Holden? The generational shift perhaps that's happening, or at least the cultural one, where there is a generation of sexually active men now who do just instinctively feel that it should be something that they are accountable for as their female counterparts are. And maybe that wasn't the case a generation ago. Yeah,
I think that's probably true. And, Leif was saying that it was a conversation that she had been having with her friends for years. But I think it's not something that most men will talk about. It's just
not locker room chat, is it?
No, it isn't. And I think that's, in part perhaps just because there aren't nearly as many options for male contraception as there are for women. And I think one of the reasons that there is continual interest in something like a contraceptive pill for men is that it would actually just be another option on the table. And it isn't, I don't think it's meant to replace condoms, because this pill wouldn't have any effect against sexually transmitted diseases. It's not going to work necessarily for everyone, but it would mean, particularly if you were moving from a casual relationship into a more long-term relationship, it then means that there is another option beyond simply switching to a technique where the woman has to take the entire kind of responsibility and burden of that.
I suppose the thing is, though, Leif, and I can see how, because you only take this pill, as I understand it, within an hour of intercourse, so I suppose it could be sexualized in itself. It could be part of sexual play taking this pill. But still, it's a medical thing, right? And it sort of implies a conversation about whether or not we want to get pregnant every time you have sex. I mean, the difference about the female pill is it's something that's taken, continuously, more or less. Whereas in this case, every time before sex, you're going to have that conversation. Do you think that could be a barrier?
I don't think that's I think in some cases that would happen, but I think practically, if you're in a relationship, you could have the general principle is we don't want to have a baby right now, and so of an evening, the boyfriend or the person could just take the pill as they're taking their vitamins or whatever. I don't think you have to have a DMC about like, oh, should we have little Henrietta or Henry or whoever, in 9 months' time. So yeah, I mean, for some people, maybe they will have those heavy conversations, but I think it could be platted into a routine fairly seamlessly.
I mean, it's so fascinating, that thing, Cindy, that Holden mentioned earlier, which is one of the resistances to this, has been that kind of either the pharmaceutical companies perceived that men don't want to take a hormone-changing pill, or in fact, men don't, when that is the reality for women. Like, their hormones get changed by taking contraceptives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just another way in which our society is still pretty imbalanced when it comes to treating women. I mean, when it comes to the pill, I think Leaf is so totally right that girls talk about it all the time. Women have to talk about it because it's such a present part of your life, and you don't really have much choice if you want to be sexually active. And yet it impacts your body in all sorts of ways that I think girls, because it is often teenage girls who go into it first, they're not told about a lot. I remember being very shocked a few years ago, which is when I found out that the pill-free week, so you're meant to take 21 days on, 7 days off traditionally, that was actually just a arbitrary design thing to please the Pope. It was that was just put in there. It has no medical benefit at all, and actually means that the hormones in your body make you more likely to get pregnant during that pill-free week. But it was just put in there so that you would have some kind of imitation menstruation, so that the Pope and Catholics would get more on side. I mean, it's just the ways in which that the female body are messed around because of our societal mores. So sorry to sound a bit ranty on this one, but yeah, I don't remember what your original question was now, Ollie. But yeah, men should have their hormones messed with too.
Or no one should have their hormones messed with. I suppose that's the other thing. Isn't it, Holden? This could be indicative. This could be indicative of future medicine that doesn't mess with people's hormones, and that's encouraging too.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, there was another male contraceptive I saw about a few years ago that was very much in the early stages, and it was like a button that you can have installed into your penis, which basically is like a little tap. You can basically turn on and off your semen.
You're not getting invited onto the show again, Holden.
Yeah, I think the marketing department immediately switched off this podcast at the phrase "installed into your penis." But that did. I mean, there has been research on another male contraceptive approach, which I suppose is more of a parallel with the IUD or the implant. Which, and again, I think pharmaceutical marketers should probably turn their speakers off now. But that involved 2 injections into each testicle, essentially, to insert a kind of plastic polymer that simply blocked the flow of sperm cells. But again, there was just a sense that was not going to reach a wide audience. I think on the question of whether we can get beyond a hormonal approach to birth control, that I read a few reports that said if the female contraceptive pill was in research now, that probably would not get to market by today's standards, just because the level of scrutiny on side effects, particularly on something that's going to be used long term by people who have no other health conditions. There's just a really, really high bar to clear there. And as it happens, the female birth control pill was developed at a time when those standards just didn't exist. But it seems that this particular approach is, it's still in the early stages. It hasn't yet been tested in humans. It could still fall foul of some of these barriers. But so far, because of the mechanism it uses, which is effectively to stop sperm cells being activated at the point of ejaculation, because I hadn't realized actually that sperm are sort of stored in a dormant state. So in mice and in human sperm cells in the lab, when they are exposed to this particular protein in this new drug, they're just never activated. So they remain dormant for a period. And that's seen as a much less medically interventionist way of accomplishing the same end.
Yeah, so this was tested on mice, 100% effective in mice, Leaf. None of the girl mice got pregnant after the boy mice had been given this pill, which does show, perhaps, the benefits of testing medicine on animals, doesn't it? We'd never know about this if we weren't messing about with mice.
Yeah, to me, it doesn't sound like it was too harrowing an experience for these mice. I think it just depends on where you sit on what use to which animals should be put. Personally, I have no issue with using animals to investigate really important questions like this for human beings. As long as the animals aren't treated in a needlessly cruel way. There'll be plenty of people who kind of are horrified by that. But then we're living with the benefits of animal testing every day. So many of our medicines have been based on those methods. So yes, not that I need persuading. This is further evidence of the use of all those trials.
Okay, and if the trials go well, Holden, when they go on to its rabbits next, isn't it, before men get to take it?
Yeah, that pleased me. I think you should definitely do fertility studies with rabbits.
What's the timeline for this actually reaching the shelves for human gentlemen?
The researchers are saying that it will be at least 2025. I should say that in doing the research for this, I have read many other old reports of predictions that other previous generations of male pill will have reached the shelves at various stages between then and now. So I think we should not hold out too much hope that timetable will turn into reality.
They promised us we could take it shortly before sexual intercourse. I'm not going to schedule in 2 years. Leaf, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Leaf, it is your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The ballooning reliance on consultants.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm a consultant. Hi, how are you? I'm a consultant. Let me just consult on that thing for you. Brilliant, thanks. Consulting, PowerPoint. Yeah, let me get that for you. I'll make some. Yes, I'll get on that.
A video from YouTuber and consultant Tintin Smith. Leaf, what's the story?
So according to a Times report out this week, the Home Office and the Ministry of Defence of the UK have apparently led a surge in government spending on management consultants. And there was a recent £4 million splurge on a contract to Deloitte to handle small boats arrivals. This fits into a bigger story about the rise in the use of consultants by the government. There were efforts to kind of really clamp down on it early on in Cameron's government, but basically the taps are on and on full at the moment.
Yeah, because some of the things these consultants are doing, Cindy, aren't what you think when you think consultancy, are they? I mean, as Leaf just described, dealing with small boat arrivals, creating the NHS COVID app, that's not just a case of a polite young gentleman in a jacket like the one we just heard coming and saying, hello, let me show you a bar chart.
Right. And consultants are trained and they're recruited as generalists. And in my understanding from the bright young people around me who have gone into consultancy, they're looking at organizational structures and cultures and that kind of stuff rather than technological research. So, there will be very specific consultancies like Palantir, for example, that are very good at big data and scrutinize all of that and help the NHS vaccine rollout. But to go to somewhere like Deloitte for a test and trace app, it is a bit confusing. And I think one of the points that critics have made is why isn't the government developing its own in-house experts on this kind of stuff or putting more research and funding into specific technical knowledge, other R&D companies and that kind of thing, instead of going to generalists who might be very pleasant and might be very bright and went to Oxbridge, but fundamentally don't necessarily know much about medicine or the migration crisis.
I mean, the mantra that applies in corporate worlds, Holden, is often no one ever got fired for hiring McKinsey. This idea like if there's a problem, at least you can explain to your boss, well, this is why we spent £1 million trying to fix it. We went to the best. That's what they do. Do you think there's an element of that, of just like government being able to say, well, we've outsourced to people who really know what they're doing? And if so, does that speak to a lack of confidence in the civil service?
Yeah, I think there's a few different strands there. One definitely is you get politicians actually both ends of the political spectrum, sometimes not wanting to use the civil service for what would previously have been considered sort of core civil service duties. And there was a huge expansion of the use of external consultancies. And actually, as you say, it's not necessarily consultancies, it's consulting companies are then delivering large parts of government services in the early 2000s. And there it just seemed to be almost a lack of capacity in the civil service and a difficulty in scaling up quickly enough to deliver what the sort of, what New Labour was trying to do in terms of transforming the public sector. But then you can also have politicians who feel that the civil service is actually kind of willfully obstructing what they're trying to do. And you sort of, Liz Truss was the ultimate example of that, but it sort of tends to be more embedded on the right. And there, the idea of bringing in external consultancies can be a feeling that you can sort of bring in more of a sense of dynamism, more of a sense of free markets, and introduce ideas and ways of doing business that wouldn't necessarily come out of the usual civil service pipeline.
Which offices are the biggest spenders, Leaf?
So I think it's the MOD first and then the Home Office second. So the Home Office is spending on things like IT, and the MOD has a deal with Quinitech to build a new generation of submarines. And it also apparently gave Microsoft over £30 million. So these consultants are being drafted in for really different reasons. But in 2020, there was an interesting sort of letter that got leaked from a minister called Lord Agnew, who said that this reliance on consultants was infantilizing the civil service. And obviously this is the big worries about this kind of increasing reliance.
And I think just on the point of the submarine building, it's important to note that this company, they're not the submarine builder. They're not delivering the ship. They're actually just involved. They're sort of managing the contracts, as I understand. They're doing the job that in previous generations the Ministry of Defence would have done in terms of, working with the shipyard and speccing the sort of weapon systems and other characteristics of the submarine they're trying to build.
And that being the case then, Cindy, when you're looking at kind of graduate employment routes, you can see, can't you, why some bright young things would rather go and work for consultants who are then going to be employed by the government on the exciting projects anyway, rather than going to work for the civil service directly for less money.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've got friends who used to work in the civil service, have now gone into consulting, but pretty much do the same thing and are paid much more, and also working for government to do that. So the government is paying the same person to do the same work, but more, because they're now billing themselves as as part of a private consultancy. And, good for them, because why wouldn't you do that in terms of the people involved rather than the government? But I think the government has
why would government be structured that way?
Right, exactly. Why the government has a cultural problem where it's kind of happy to pay out extortionate amounts for external private consultants, whilst instead of paying its own civil servants more, or instead of attracting talent that would be wanting to be paid more. And we're talking in a week of civil service strikes as well. So all of this just seemed to be quite short-termist thinking of contracting out your problems, hoping and wishing that other people are going to solve them better, instead of thinking, how can we develop our in-house talent? And obviously sometimes the in-house talent just isn't up to scratch, and that's totally fine. But I'm really not sure how a civil servant can't manage a contract on submarines as well as another private consultancy.
And more broadly on consultants, Leaf, because, this story, this data did spark a lot of comment on the kind of websites where people who have used consultants gather, on the FT and the Spectator and the Economist. There were a lot of comments from people saying things like, consultants are completely useless. It's someone bright and young and polite, but they ask us everything about our job. We tell it to them, they tell it back to us and charge us for the privilege, and they tell us nothing we didn't know.
Yeah, you're right.
How did it become such a big industry?
Well, I think it had a big boom time in the 1970s, which ended with the arrival of Margaret Thatcher and Reagan. But the idea was that, we're going to smaller state, and we're going to, rely more on sort of business to sort of solve all our problems. But if you look at some of the areas in which consultants have been drafted in the UK, like borders and stuff like that, you think, well, that situation doesn't seem to be any improved with the help of all these consultants. There was a National Audit Office report in 2016, so some time ago, but I don't see why it would be different. that found that consultants typically cost the government departments twice as much as an equivalent permanent staff member. So, the idea is that these consultants should be providing double the value of a civil servant. But I don't really think that that's necessarily borne out. Mariana Mazzucato, who is an economist, has written a book with another academic, Rosie Collington, which is, I think, out this week, called The Big Con, which basically argues that consultants are sort of magicians whose big trick is to sort of make government ministers and companies that think they need help think that McKinsey et al. Have the answer, when actually the book's argument is that they don't really at all. And often, I've encountered people, my peers who are like, 25 or whatever. I mean, I'm 30, but I remember going on a terrible, terrible date with someone when I was about 25, who was doing some sort of consultancy in, I think it was a council, and opened up his spreadsheet and was showing me all the jobs that were being cut. And you just think there's this 25-year-old person who's just started growing his own stubble, who's making these big decisions. Like, why does he know? It's ridiculous.
Why would they know, Holden? I mean, what is the argument for consultants, particularly at that kind of graduate level, where someone's gone into it because they're getting the big bucks and they don't know anything about the business they're going into? Why would they be able to suggest something that might be helpful?
I think there's a couple of arguments. One being that almost their absence of knowledge is a strength, in that they don't come to it with the sort of groupthink that you might have in a company or a government department that's maybe tried something 10 years ago and then said that didn't work then, so we're never going to try it again, but the market has changed, and so there's sort of fresh thinking. But I think the other reason is the idea that actually, in moving from company to company and perhaps sector to sector and private sector to public sector, these consultancies do build up a much wider range of knowledge and expertise about the market than a single company or a single civil servant who's been doing one thing all of their lives can muster. And so the idea is that you get a kind of a synergy, and you get a broader sense of what is possible.
Cindy?
I think from having tried to apply for consultancy at university as well, they are really, really smart people, and that's probably why I didn't get in. The kind of aptitude tests that you need to do, the training camps. I went on to a McKinsey residential course once, and
tell us about that.
Well, it was at school. I was in sixth form, and they were kind of inspiring young people, as it were, to go to McKinsey. And it sounds like a great job. You get travel, you get highly paid, interesting, challenging problems, right, to fire people. That didn't come up so much, but it was intellectually really, really stimulating. You have to be good at maths, you have to be good at people relations, you have to be good at logic, and really apply a lot of different parts of your brain in a way that I think your classic, cog of the machine civil servant maybe doesn't have to. So I think that is one argument as well, that these are actually solidly really, really intelligent people. I don't think that trumps institutional knowledge, but that's another argument as well.
I suppose that's the thing, isn't it, Leif, that actually when government works with consultancy, you get both. You get the breath of fresh air and the person who can speak truth to power, but you also get the institutional knowledge. That's why it's easy for government to say, well, we're doing both. We have our civil servants and we have consultants. What's wrong with that?
Well, you would hope so. That sounds like a kind of ideal situation in some ways.
Thanks. I'll bill you afterwards. I'm very reasonable for a consultant.
Well, right. But there are just lots of situations where, we don't seem to be left with all that much to show for it. Whether you agree that consultants are kind of, pulling a sort of a confidence trick or not. I think it's hard to object to the idea that, the UK government should look at its stock of very clever civil servants and try to train them up. We have a major issue in the UK with a lack of in-house, in-job training. We should be we're really falling behind our kind of peers. And this, to me, is a fairly classic case of the government saying, "Oh gosh, we need government businesses need to invest way more in equipment and in their own staff," and not actually doing it themselves.
Yeah, and make that job more appealing, Holden. I mean, we've had various alumni of this podcast who have dipped in and out of the civil service as their second job from journalism and then realised it's just too boring.
I think if you're hiving off all the most exciting parts and giving them to external contractors, then that's going to make that problem worse. I read a couple of suggestions that one of the skills that we really should be fostering in the civil service is actually working with consultants and managing them better. But there was, in all seriousness, a sort of suggestion that one of the reasons that that consultancy often seems to fail when it's applied to government is that the civil servants who are managing them just don't know how to specify what they want and then manage that relationship to a conclusion. And often the consultants are almost set up to fail, in that they're given problems that are known to be insoluble or where the solution is known to be politically unpalatable, and it's just a way of shifting the blame outside the department onto another group. But there was a Public Accounts Committee report more than 15 years ago now saying, actually, if this is something that clearly can be made to work. It has worked well in particular cases in the UK and in other parts of Europe and the US. It's just that we need to make that a real focus of what the civil service is doing and build up the confidence in the civil service to do the things it can do well, but also to recognise where there are gaps in that experience and recognise how to then get that out of third parties when we need them.
Okay, I'm going to manage this conversation to a conclusion. Cindy, you're up next after this. Okay, Cindy, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The race for electric cars is speeding up.
I believe that building in America matters more than ever. Ford has a long history of investing in manufacturing all across this country. But today we're pleased to announce a $3.5 billion investment to build a brand new next-gen EV battery plant right here in our home state of Michigan and right here in the United States.
Bill Ford, or William Clay Ford Jr. is his full job title name, executive chairman of Ford Motor Company. Did you know that Ford still ran Ford? I didn't. Speaking on Monday. Cindy, what's the story?
So this is a direct reaction to this massive stimulus package that Joe Biden has put in as of last summer, where there are $370 billion worth of subsidies for green energy. A huge chunk of that is going to go to electric cars. So basically, car makers from across the world are racing to build their American factories in order to benefit from it, because you have to have a plant in America to benefit from the money.
Okay, so Ford have announced an all-new EV for the domestic market built in America, basically. That's exactly what Biden wanted to achieve through what he's called the Inflation Reduction Act, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is exactly what they wanted. It's not just Ford. Other companies like BMW have also moved over. There are some concerns over the European and British startups that are being attracted over there. Basically, Biden is trying to make a domestic, made in America electric vehicle industry, because at the moment the US actually lags behind China and the EU on that particular industry, and just chucking money at it. And if you're running a EV company, you're like, yeah, get me some of that stuff as well. And all you have to do is pledge some investment in the States.
And promise not to use Chinese bits as well. It's the carrot and stick, right?
Yes. So basically, for a newly sold electric vehicle, you can get $7,500 off of it if you comply with all of the different stipulations, and you can comply with a mixer of them. One of the stipulations is that majority has to be made or assembled in America or in North America. So Canada and Mexico is also okay. But that means that also your battery has to be coming from those areas as well. So at the moment, a lot of these electric vehicle batteries and electric vehicles themselves are coming from China, because China holds, I think it's something like 80% of the world's EV battery production capacity. So it's all about cutting China out, building and making America great again. And we can see companies basically starting to react to it.
So, Holden, we discussed actually last week the regulations around the supply chain of electric vehicles when it came to chips. So now there's this question of economic viability to bear in mind as well, because these regulations in one way create the impression of making it easy to be green. But to an extent, if you're a global corporate car maker, it's actually getting harder. It's getting more logistically complicated, isn't it? You can use this bit, you can't use that bit. You have to base it here to get this tax break. You can only sell it there.
Yeah, this is definitely has some overall benefits for green tech, but it also introduces some complications too. I think the initial reaction to Cindy mentioned, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act. It was originally called the Build Back Better bill, but when sort of political, and that possibly is a better would have been a better name for it, because the idea then was it was about coming out of COVID and trying to kind of develop green technology. It was actually sort of political pressure around the midterms when inflation was a real hot button issue and the Biden was being accused of not doing enough about it. He switched the name without actually really switching any of the measures, which is why it has this slightly confusing name.
And acronym IRA, which you might think would be loaded, although it's possibly easier to say than which is what it would have been.
It's not like Biden's Irish or anything.
Yeah.
I think the initial reaction to it passing was that this is a really good thing, that the US is now kind of taking green investment seriously. There was then a subsequent backlash, particularly amongst European green technologists, that this was actually as much about protectionism as it is about the environment. And in an ideal world, green subsidies would be about fostering activity that would not otherwise have taken place, and building up technologies that don't yet have enough of a foothold that they're viable on the open market. Whereas if you look particularly at the electric vehicle parts of this bill, what it seems to be doing in practice is encouraging companies to move existing production from other places to the US, which isn't actually increasing the overall production of electric vehicles, isn't really advancing that technology, and could actually end up as a bit of a break in the long run, because the more you insulate American producers from external competition, the less likely it is that they develop better products, and the more of a subsidy you give them, the less incentive there is to bring those prices down through normal market pressures.
Yeah, just explain, Cindy, why the EU would feel that it might be left behind. Why can't the EU match what America's doing?
So the way that the bill is written is basically any country that has a free trade agreement with the US has an exemption from these local production rules. That's why Canada and Mexico production lines in those countries can benefit from the tax credits. But the EU doesn't have a free trade agreement with the US, and neither does the UK. So companies that are at the moment having their production lines majority in the EU or the UK or using in China, they basically can't benefit. And so they become less competitive when they're trying to sell to the American market. There's also some other stuff in terms of how much direct support that the companies themselves get. And so we've already seen, BMW has announced a $2 billion plant in South Carolina. There's a Swedish battery maker, which is a bit of a startup and a bit of a hope for Europe when it comes to getting into the sphere. It's actually delaying its investments in Germany in favor of going to America as well. So it's just basically decisions like that European officials are concerned that means that in the long term, their industry is going to be hobbled by what's happening with everyone moving stateside.
But then the costs of shipping things over, Holden, also has to be factored in too, doesn't it, once the vehicles are actually made? I mean, obviously Fords are always going to sell better in America than they are here. Minis are always going to sell better in Europe than they are in America. There's a domestic market too.
There is, and the electric car market has been predominantly about domestic production for a local market so far. So I have read sort of some skepticism about this is certainly having an effect, but it may not have as much of an effect as feared. I think some of the more insidious effects may be sort of further down the supply chain, with things like battery production, and the production of electric cars is actually now very well established as a mature industry. Where we really need that innovation is in the kind of battery tech and the more of the kind of infrastructure side that Leaf was talking about, the sort of fast chargers, solutions in rural areas, solutions actually in cities like London where a lot of people park their cars on the road. And so I think maybe that's an opportunity for the EU, instead of trying to compete head on with the US on some of the subsidies for car producers, is actually to try and look for areas where the industry is a little bit more under mature, or an opportunity for Labour as it starts to think about how it's developing the sort of green economic vision that it's trying to present in the run-up to the next election. Being able to give voters a sense that you can help to foster a clean, green industry that's going to create jobs is a really good way of sort of squaring what has previously been seen as a conflict between the environment and the economy. The American bill, in a slightly clumsy way, has managed to at least seem to do that. I think the ball probably is in the court of both the EU and the UK to try and come up with its own approach to that particular conundrum.
And it is interesting, isn't it, Leif, that this is kind of Biden doing America first, isn't it, under a different name? I mean, this is a policy that Trump would like.
Yeah, and to some extent, sort of a slightly mean part of me thinks, well, why not? Like, let him look out for his own country. You know, he's been elected to sort of be a kind of president for Americans, not for the EU and the UK. But of course, where there's tension is that it feels like the EU and the UK are kind of carrying the can. So America wants us to be, robustly sort of acting and talking against China, but it isn't giving us any kind of, well, supposedly this is the argument, it's not giving us the sort of rewards and the incentives to do that. So it's kind of, you go and fight the good fight, but we're just going to look after our own people here. So that's leading to a lot of annoyance, and you can really understand why all over Europe. And Macron himself was saying that was annoyed about it at a recent meeting.
And with the West trying to speak in one voice over Ukraine, Cindy, do you think that's a concern?
Yeah, I think it's not a concern insofar as I don't think it would change any actual outward policy. But for countries like Germany, where the government was already unsure about the US-led way into the war, just look at the way that their feet dragged over giving Leopard tanks to Ukraine. And yet Germany is the economic leader of the EU. It is actually responsible for more than half of the subsidies that the EU doles out every year.
Make a lot of cars.
And a lot of cars, yeah, and a lot of car manufacturers that might be attracted to the US. So it's just not a good way to play politics in your internal Western alliance. Now, I think that we're getting into a stage of geopolitics where people have to pick sides, and anyone who's vaguely Western is going to pick the US side as opposed to China and Russia. So fundamentally, it doesn't change anything there, but it does make the alliance that little bit more hard to swallow for countries that were already a little bit irritated. And I think France and Germany historically haven't followed the US as much as the UK has anyway. I mean, they don't talk about a special relationship. France never supported the Iraq War, all that sort of stuff. But it does just, I always think that, this idea of the West is very interesting to pick apart. And I think this is just the latest kind of thorn in that alliance.
Well, with that, our battery charge has gone down to 0, I'm afraid. My thanks to Cindy and to Holden and to Leif. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. Just tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription. Go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.